Hello. It has been quite a while since Hub's History Online has come back to your computer, but we are changing topics, therefore we are adding brand new videos to the coming weeks, trying to make the rest of the semester as fun and entertaining as possible, but at the same time, educational. We are going to delve into a very, very, very sensitive subject, and that is human rights violations. There is probably no sadder act a government can do. You know, when you think about like mass murder, we've seen lots of it. But mass murder by a government on its own people, now that's something that's really, really extreme. Especially after the fact that we've already explained that genocide and race murder and the extermination of a race is not allowed. It's illegal. There should be people held accountable, and people should go to jail or worse, be put to death for those crimes. And unfortunately, we are going to venture into an area where sometimes justice is not served. Sometimes the guilty never face punishment. So we are going to start in South America. If we take a quick recap, we've already looked at mass murder or genocides in Armenia by the Ottoman Empire, in the Ukraine by the Soviet Union, in Japan, well, technically in China, but by the Japanese, and of course the last one that we talked about was the Holocaust by the Nazis. We did bring up Pol Pot in Cambodia, so far we've talked about 5. But we can also use the denial of human rights by the British against the Indians, the denial of equal rights, blacks and whites, apartheid in South Africa. All of these are human rights violations. But the ones that we're going to be talking about over the next few days are going to be new to you. There's a lot of you who have never heard of any of these people or any of these regions, to be honest with you. So it is going to make this stuff brand new and a little more difficult. But just please bear with me and follow along closely. Now, one of the first places we're going to go to is Argentina. Now, if you notice the year is 1976 to 1983, we are still in the midst of the Cold War. But because the US and the USSR were involved in their own little conflict, you are going to start to see problems appear in regions like South America and Africa. And that is because these are the locations where a lot of proxy wars take place. The proxy wars, remember, are a series of wars fought for the ideologies of the US and the USSR, not actually fought by the nations. In Argentina, we have a brand new military government that is doing what military governments have always done, abusing its power. They would literally abduct people off the street if they didn't like what they were doing, torture them, execute them. They basically made a brand new word. Now, there is a word you guys know, disappear, to disappear. It's an action. But they actually made the verb to be disappeared, meaning they would make you vanish for protesting, for saying anything against the government. The Argentinian government, will use a method very similar to Stalin's method in the Soviet Union. To be disappeared means that there will never be a trace of you found. They would erase your existence from their nation. But the Argentinian government never, ever acknowledged what they had done. As a matter of fact, it is now 2020. Families still do not know what happened to anyone that was disappeared. They were buried in mass graves, the bodies were destroyed, but there were no records kept of what actually happened to them. So families for decades now have been looking for answers, but I hate to be the bearer of bad news. They are never going to find them. In response to the government's abductions, parents began to show up at government buildings demanding to know the whereabouts of their children. So one day, a few mothers showed up outside a government facility, and the next day a few more came, and the next day a few more came, and they became known as the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo. These women, who by the way still exist, the organization is still around, have been asking for answers for more than 40 years. They openly protested the Argentinian government at the time, stating that they made their children disappear, and they demanded answers. But because their system was not organized, the government didn't know what happened to these people. They were killed, probably, but where their bodies are still a mystery. So the women took to the newspapers. They took to the public forum. They spoke in front of these buildings to anyone that would listen. Where are our children? Where are our family members? Where are they? And they never heard a response. But because their message became so loud, people around the world became interested in what was going on in Argentina. The Cold War, still probably the biggest news in the world, was beginning to take a back seat because Argentina was doing something that they weren't supposed to do. So people began to form these groups, the mothers groups, all over South America. Because even though Argentina was probably the most famous country doing the disappearing of people, there were other governments that had always done this. People are now fighting for human rights. They're standing up for what they believe in. But again, even after this government was removed, and some people were held accountable, they did not have the answer to the one question they all wanted to know. Where are our children? And to this day, we have no idea. They believe that they may have been buried somewhere in a mass grave. Argentina is an enormous country. But other people believe that they put the bodies outside their borders, meaning they buried them in other nations. So we will never really have an answer. Human rights were violated. Some people were punished. But unfortunately, no family is getting that one thing that they need, and that is closure. But the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo were not the only people fighting for human rights at this time. Another nation that was affected by change during this Cold War period was Chile. Chile was definitely a location of a proxy war. We did not like the fact that a communist government was chosen freely by the people. Now, I'm saying this in jest, of course, because you guys know that if we, the United States, do not like something, we step in militarily. But there was more proof of that during the Cold War than any other period. Any time a communist government appeared, we stuck our head in and said, yeah, I don't think so. No dice. We don't like it. And we would remove it. In this case, we replaced it with a man that we thought we could control. We called him the savior of democracy, General Augusto Pinochet. And because he swore that he was democratic, we believed him. To be honest with you, the fact that he was against communism is really all we needed to know. We didn't care what they were doing in Chile. We didn't care what he was doing in Chile. We didn't really give a crap, so long as they weren't communist. And that is why we gave them lots and lots and lots of money. But if we only knew what he was actually doing, maybe we would have done something to stop him. But because he was loyal to us, we allowed him to do what all dictators do: abuse their power. Execution, rape, murder, destruction of anyone who opposed him, the denial of basic rights and freedoms. He's a dictator. That's what dictators do. But because we said dictator, but he's democratic. Dictator, but he's democratic. He's denying rights. Democracy? Democracy. That's all we heard. As a matter of fact, we didn't even care. We were too busy with the Soviet Union. And remember, he promised he was democratic. But the military leadership, led by this man, was causing fear and terror throughout his nation. It is said that more than 30,000 people will be murdered in some way, shape, or form during his reign. Now, obviously, that's a small number compared to some of the other ones we've talked about. But this man was supposed to be a beacon of democracy. And in reality, what he was just another dictator. Pinochet was never punished for his crimes. He is a man that escaped justice. He is a man that never faced his accusers. And it's sad because he was a monster. Not on a scale of a Hitler or a Stalin. But any time a leader denies basic rights, they should be held accountable. This man wasn't. One last place that we're going to look at today is a nation that we have not spoken about, and that is Guatemala. Guatemala is a very, very small country in in between Mexico and South America. It's connected in that way. And when you look at one of the things that starts to happen is that during the 1950s and 60s, a lot of military governments take over these nations. And because we were in the midst of the Cold War, we really couldn't get involved. But military leadership, military-style governments have always been around. It's just that some military governments enact mass amounts of violence, mass amounts of murder. And this government was no different. Now, there was a local family known as the Menchu family. The Menchu family was an open advocate against these violations. And sadly, the father and a few other family members were murdered by this Guatemalan government, which led to the rise of one of his daughters, Rigoberta Menchu. She became an advocate for human rights. As a matter of fact, she openly denounced the government demanding change. But because she was so vocal about it, they wanted her dead. So she had to flee the country. But in her exile, and she did it herself, but in her exile, she continued to openly fight against not only this government, but openly fight for human rights around the world. She became a feature for anyone who was held down and oppressed by an abusive government. So she comes from that same long line of nationalist human rights fighters like a Gandhi or like a Mandela. But you've never heard of Rigoberta Menchu. This is a woman who is vital to understanding the power of change. And because she openly fought against this government, and she made the people realize that governments did not have the right to abuse their people, she became a national figure, a worldwide figure. As a matter of fact, she will win the Nobel Peace Prize for her fight for human rights. She is one of the leading women that we are going to talk about in this unit. And there are many women during this time frame who finally make their voice heard. Now, you've probably never heard of Rigoberta Menchu, but she is extremely important, giving voices to people who never realized they had one. Because of her, people will be punished for their crimes. Because of her and people like her, the masses will not have to stand for abuse. The little people, the ones without the voice, can finally stand up and fight back. So when you look at these people, some abusers, some fighters, it just goes to show you that history is full of this: fighting, oppression, abuse, violence. But what comes from it is hope. Rigoberta Menchu is one of many women that we're going to speak about, and men, in the coming days. Your assignment today is going to be this workbook page. It's going to be in a Google Doc, so you guys can just click the Google Doc and write the answers in the Google Doc and submit it. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this lesson. I will see you guys tomorrow on the next Hubs History Online.